Welcome to another edition of the Public Affairs Public Access Program. Every year in Harris County, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, there's an election. This evening, we are going to discuss the election and try to provide voters all the information, rudimentary information that they need to be able to access the voting process. And hopefully by the end of the night, folks will be well informed and they'll be raring to go on Monday to go vote. This evening, we have the honor of having a staff member from the Harris County Clerk's Office who's an expert on voter outreach and conveying messages about elections to the public. So I want to welcome her. Her name is Tanisha Hudspeth. Good evening, Tanisha.
Pleasure being here today. Thank you for having me.
So tell us, I know that in the, what you do, tell us what you do.
So for some time now, we basically, in our office in communications department, we do everything that we can to make sure voters are thoroughly informed and have the resource and materials they need to execute and actually cast their ballot before or on election day. So that entails everything from visiting many areas of the community to answer questions regarding the process and to provide context regarding elections and the process. It also includes just making sure that media and publications and whether it's print, whether it's televised, that all those sources are accessible for voters to have as they prepare for every election cycle.
Well, I see that today we're going to be reviewing a presentation. Tell us about the presentation itself, not necessarily what's in it, but how who you share this presentation with. I know you were telling me a little bit about meetings that you have throughout the community, and can you tell us something a little bit about that?
Well, for years now, the communications department conduct what is considered advisory meetings, and this is across the entire county. Harris County is a special county in regards that we provide language assistance in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese. And so each one of those communities, including just the general public, we are diligent about visiting all areas of the counties, but hosting these advisory meetings. And the advisory meetings are public, are open to the public. However, we invite everyone from elected official offices, those that serve as precinct chairs and judges who are part of the political process by working in there, the media. It is a vehicle for the county clerk's office to work with community leaders, people that are already doing the work, doing voter registration, are active in the community with making sure voters are entailed on what's going on. And so in these meetings, one of the various things we do is we get to provide the presentations, one of the presentations that we're going to look at tonight. And it's in totality, currently where we're at, what election is going on, what's those important facts you need to know about that election, and what are just the main things that voters need to know as they prepare for each election cycle.
So in sum, you provide information to the general public, but you also focus on language groups and groups that are covered by the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Sure.
Because I know that you mentioned Spanish speakers, Vietnamese speakers, and Chinese speakers, but you also have an outreach program for the African-American community.
That's right. So it's a task force of influential leaders and community servants that do the work in our African-American community, all the way from 3rd Ward to Acres Home to many different areas. And this committee meets just like all the others to really just cover and make sure that the basis of the elections process, that our voters are well informed in our communities, and making sure that we're attending a civic association meetings, providing that information so those that are involved have the resources and the right tools to give that information.
You mentioned that you talk to people about elections, and I know you mentioned to me off air that sometimes you get questions about elections for next year, and that the public is really not familiar with the structure of elections or what guides elections. Tell us about this, the election calendar you were mentioning, and how that actually provides some structure to what goes on when
Sure.
there's an election cycle.
So that's actually a very good topic that you bring up. There is two uniform elections, most certainly every election year. But every November, there's something for voters to vote on. And the Texas Secretary of State sets the dates and deadlines in the context to how counties in the state of Texas will go about not just executing an election, but what has to be done prior to that election. And with that being said, the Secretary of State has set deadlines for 2017 that we'll talk about, but most importantly, you're right, I'm already getting calls regarding 2018. What's going to be on the ballot for November? Well, there's a March primary that will take place first, and the Secretary of State releases those dates almost months prior to that year. It includes everything from candidates information. If you're running for office, it includes what your deadlines are as a candidate. If you're voting, it includes the method of voting that you're choosing to vote in and what your deadlines are to execute those ballots. It includes dates for county offices and elections administrators to be sure that they're meeting the deadlines to best prepare and do the work prior to election day or prior to voters voting. So with that being said, we have some important
What are the important dates for this election?
We have important dates for this election. And it really does start with the top of the year. Seniors and disabled voters are qualified to vote by mail if they choose to do so. And if they choose to vote by mail, those seniors or disabled voters are able to request a mail ballot as early as January 1st. So as early as January 1st of 2017 of this year, voters can vote what is called an annual ballot by mail. And that ensures that they can choose whatever election may take place in that full calendar year. Their ballots will automatically come in the mail. Now, again, this is for those persons that are seniors or disabled.
Do they? I know there's a form that. Do they have to check off certain information to ensure that they get a ballot for every election that occurs during that election
That's
year?
correct. So every person that applies for a ballot by mail has to fill out an application. That application allows several different boxes. One of them is, do you want an annual ballot by mail? And if you check annual ballot by mail on the application, any election taking place will allow them to vote for that entire calendar year. They can also choose to vote by the type of election that year, meaning they can check off, I just want to vote in the primary, or I just want to vote in November. But if they choose to do that, then they'll only receive a ballot for that particular election cycle. However, if they choose annual ballot by mail, our office and a signature is there. Our office assumes that you want every ballot for that calendar year. For those voters who are just voting by mail but are not seniors or disabled, that includes those who may be out of the county. And as we know, we just had Harvey to pass, and there are a lot of voters that might have been displaced or had to leave to go with family because of the storm. So if they are...
Let's,
Sure.
leave that for a minute.
A little later on.
We'll cover that. But when it comes to the important dates you mentioned, you were talking about the ballot by mail dates. So
Sure.
you mentioned that the earliest that some folks get qualified to apply for a ballot by mail is the first day of the calendar year. Is there a deadline?
There's a deadline. For this November 7th, the last day to apply for a ballot by mail for this election is October the 27th. So that means that application has to be received in our office, and anyone that is eligible to vote by mail can either apply by emailing the application, faxing the application, or actually mailing the application to our offices. So again, that's emailing the application, faxing the application, or mailing the actual application to our office.
Where can they go to find that information?
I'm so glad you asked. They can go to our most friendly elections website, harrisvotes.com. And that website, you can reach .com, .net, or .org, but it's Harris Votes with an S. And this website covers everything about elections that a voter would need to know. And one of those tabs under voting is going to be the voting by mail process. It includes the application where someone can actually print the application offline and fill it out and either fax it, email it, or mail the application. Our office, if you choose to call because you don't have online access, you can choose to call and we'll send the application in the mail. However, October 27th is the deadline for us to receive the application, and that gives us enough time to ensure your mail ballot is actually sent before Election Day, because as we know, all ballots have to be in, whether it's mailing, whether it's voting early in person, by Election Day, which is November 7th. That's the very most important, one of the very most top of the list important dates.
What are other dates? I know voting starts pretty soon. What
Sure. Well, of course, with voting by mail, we have some voters who've already decided to exercise their right by voting by mail. But this Monday, October the 23rd, early voting in person begins. And early voting in person is a 12-day period where voters can choose to vote at any of our, in this case, 46 locations in Harris County that's provided by Harris County. And there are 12 days. The first week of early voting is from 8 to 4:30 p.m. It includes a weekend in there. So those who can't get out to early vote in time during the week, it includes a Saturday and a Sunday during that time frame. The end of early voting, which is the absolute last day to early vote in person, is November the 3rd. So that gives voters a 12-day window to get out to vote. And the last week of early voting, which is most important, the hours are extended from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., just like Election Day. And our office is really encouraging voters to get out and early vote in person. That's going to be the best way to vote and ensure, any polling locations that may have been affected. Early voting is going to be the best way to execute that. So early voting's upon us Monday, and Harris Votes, that website also, you can go there, view the early voting locations, the times, and it also has a friendly map on there that will direct you, that if you click on the numbers on the maps, it will take you directly to where the location is.
So if you live in Fort Bend County, can you vote in a Harris County early voting location?
That's actually a question I get pretty often from voters, just because Houston is a melting pot. We have a lot of counties or cities that surround Houston. And if you're in Fort Bend County and you're a registered voter in Fort Bend County, then you have to vote early in Fort Bend County. So again, all voters that are registered in Harris County can vote in Harris County. So even though it's early voting and you can vote at any one of those locations during that time frame, what's important to know is that you can only vote early in the county in which you reside and in which you're registered. So if there's a case where you've moved to Fort Bend County, but you hadn't changed your information and you're still registered in Harris County, well, then you can vote in Harris County.
And which is, now we can get back to what you mentioned previously, displaced voters, people who were impacted by the Hurricane Harvey. Let's say they live in, they're displaced and they're waiting for their home in Harris County to get fixed. So they moved them to one of the surrounding counties: Fort Bend, Montgomery, Brazoria, Liberty, Chambers, Galveston. Mm-hmm. How can they vote?
That's a even better question. Knowing if you've had to move to a surrounding county, the last day to update your voter registration or to have giving your new information or re-register was October the 10th. So if you've updated your registration to your new residence, then they can choose to vote in Galveston or Fort Bend or surrounding counties. However, if your registration is still in Harris County, you can choose to vote by mail, because technically, even though Fort Bend is right up the road, you're considered to be out of the county. And that means you can choose to vote by mail and request your ballot to be sent to Fort Bend County, and vice versa for Harris County. If you're in another county, you can do so. Regarding that you're not able to travel into Harris County and find a location that's closest to you, that's the best way we suggest is contacting our office.
So what if their home in Harris County is getting fixed, and they still consider Harris County their home and they register to vote in Harris County, but they're living right outside of Harris County, but they're driving in to go to work in Harris County. Can they just stop by at any early voting location?
They can stop by at any early voting location, and there's 46 locations. Harris Votes, we have the information there. So whether it's by your home, your church where you worship, whether it's by where you work, or maybe you pick up your children from school, any one of those locations that are within Harris County, a voter can stop by and vote, and there's that 12-day period where they can get it done.
So total, I was doing the math, it's 119 hours of early voting, so people could have plenty of time to go vote early.
And because there's one Saturday and Sunday during early voting, for that Saturday, the hours are extended. It's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So you have a full day to get to the polls that Saturday during early voting if you can't during the week. And then Sunday, it's from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the afternoon. So you do still have those 2 days. Maybe you're leaving church and there's a location close to your church or a community center, and they can choose to vote then as well. But November 3rd is the absolute deadline for early voting in person. After that point, we are approaching Election Day, which is the final day of voting. And as we all know, the early voting locations are not an option. Election Day locations are the poll in which you're registered or where you reside.
So,
and again, Harris Votes is where you can find this information.
We're talking about early voting locations. I know that typically, like last year, we had 46. Were any of the locations impacted by the flooding?
Yes, we did have several locations impacted by the flooding. And so because of that, I would say, I believe about 20% and 5%, somewhere between 20% between early voting and Election Day locations were affected. So voters should really pay attention to, is my early voting location the same as it usually is? Or if I'm voting on Election Day, is it still the same? Or has my Election Day location moved or changed due to Hurricane Harvey and repairs? So
yeah, I'm looking here at the map and I see there's 6 with yellow. They're filled in yellow. What does that mean?
And they're filled in yellow because those were locations that were definitely impacted by the storm. And so you'll see the yellow, but you'll also see like a star by it that indicates their new locations because they were impacted by the storm. So those
I see one with an X.
Yes.
What does that mean?
And so the one location with an X means it's basically under construction or it's underdeveloped. So voters can't actually go to that location during the early voting period because it's not accessible.
So in essence, there's 46 listed, but there's only 45.
But there's only 45 that voters can actually go to actually vote. So that one location is inaccessible due to the storm. The others are new locations, and all other 45 locations can be accessed.
So we're talking about voting, and so Election Day is the 7th. We're talking about the how these early voting locations were impacted by the weather. Were there any? I know typically Harris County has about 750 or so, like last year I think it was 765.
Sure.
Were any of the Election Day polling locations impacted?
Yes, so about 5%, 37 of the polling locations used in our last major election have had to be changed or consolidated. So the typical 765, 700 or so are now about 735 for this location. So one important message that we want to send to voters, and whether they visit Harris Votes or whether they call our election hotline, is knowing whether your location was one of those locations that were affected by Hurricane Harvey. And on our Harris Votes website, voters can choose to view where their poll is Election Day by entering their name and address. As simple as entering their name and address, it will show where they vote on Election Day and what specific information will be on their ballot. So we definitely encourage voters, because we had a good amount of locations affected, to know where they're going if they wait until Election Day, and make sure that they're not one of the locations that were changed or consolidated.
So you're an election administrator in Harris County. So Who can vote in Harris County?
That's a great question. Anyone that's 18 years of age, a U.S. citizen, and registered can vote in Harris County.
Register vote in Harris County.
In Harris County. If you're a registered voter in Harris County, you can exercise your right to vote in Harris County. And we've talked about pretty much the three methods of voting: voting by mail, voting early in person, which early voting starts Monday, and voting election day. So if you reside, not if you only reside, but if you're registered voters in Harris County, you can vote in this election. If you met the deadline by October 10th, you can vote in this election.
I see on what you have a table here on page 4 that is a comparison of the voter registration roll from November 2015 to September 2017. Tell us a little bit about what that is and what the names of there are.
So
listed.
what we're looking at is we're looking at not only Houston, but all of the jurisdictions and cities that surround the Houston area. I mentioned earlier that Houston is really a melting pot because you can drive a couple of miles down the road from your neighborhood and be in another city. And so what this graph really shows is, one, that registration from November 2015, because we're comparing it to an odd number year up into November 2017, is that the voter registration numbers have increased, and they have increased by about 8% or so. But this graph gives a more realistic or more close-up way to identify just how much the registration numbers have changed. And if you notice, Houston, which is in the middle, is going to have the largest population between 2015 and 2017 of registered voters. Immediately following that particular area, as far as cities, is going to be Pasadena. So the city of Pasadena.
Yeah, and I see the big gap. I mean, we can see that in the city of Houston, we have over a little over a million registered voters. And Pasadena is the second largest city.
Right.
They have 63,000. So that's obviously that you can tell that Houston is the largest political jurisdiction here in Harris County.
That's right. And then if you look all the way at the end of the graph or the end of the chart, it shows a word that says unincorporated. That means it's within the Harris County, but not necessarily within a city limit. And so that truly, if you're looking outside of the city, that's going to be the next highest number, which is right under that almost a million or so voters, is that unincorporated area. And I tell you what, that unincorporated area, we get a lot of phone calls, no matter what election year it is, depending on what's on the ballot, regarding unincorporated areas, where they reside, who represents them, and what they will see on their ballot.
I know often you mentioned that there's areas within the unincorporated areas that are called Houston, or they could be called Katy, but they're really not within those jurisdictions.
But they're not in those jurisdictions.
So
that's a really good point.
That causes a little bit confusion when it comes to voting. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's a really good point. So, for instance, for this election, there will be some propositions that voters will get to vote on if they're in the city of Houston. But oftentimes, you can be in Harris County, but outside of the city limits. Therefore, if City of Houston has propositions or candidates by district, if you don't reside or you're not registered in one of those districts, you may not see a council member A, B, or F, if you will. You will only maybe be able to vote on what is a proposition in the city. So it can be kind of confusing, maybe so for voters. If you're right on a dividing line, maybe the Beltway cuts you off from being in the city versus in the county. But
you could still be in a part of the county which is called Houston, but you're really not in Houston.
But you're really not in Houston. And so a lot of times we get many calls where voters just don't understand, well, my address says Houston, Texas, or, I paid my water bill to Houston, Texas. Why don't I see this on my ballot? And it can be that it's hard to understand the lines or the precinct lines in which allows voters to vote, whether they're in the city or county. Which brings up another point: knowing where you reside, and two, what you can expect to see on the ballot for every election, because truly, depending on where you're registered or where you live, is vital and important to know, because that depends on, it really does decide or depend on what you're going to see on your ballot. And for this November, the whole state of Texas will have 7 state constitutional amendments. So
Let's we're gonna get to that, but I'm looking at page 6 and 7, and I see the title is required identification for voting. So we talked about the elections coming up. What are the important dates? If you're a registered voter, what's required of you to present once you go to the poll?
So voters should very well be informed, and most of what's on this list here, most voters already have in their wallet, or they carry it on a daily basis with them. So I'll go through the forms, and then I'll talk about what they can expect when they walk into the poll, and how they'll be processed on election day.
Go through what it says here is here's a list of acceptable forms of photo ID.
Sure.
Tell us what those are.
So those photo IDs is first a Texas driver's license, or any one of these actually, issued by a Texas Department of Public Safety. Okay. Texas Election Identification Certificate. This is issued by the Department of Public Safety, and it is a free identification that you can receive. Texas Personal Identification Card, so basically just a personal Texas ID. A Texas license carry to handgun, okay? Handgun license, as well as the military identification card containing a person's photograph. So again, all these items include a photograph, certificate or citizenship papers with a photograph, and a United States passport. So those are the items that are first on the list when voters come in to qualify to vote, that we ask to present or prepare when you're coming in to be identified as a voter. What's most important to know, again, if any of those documents, you're elderly and they've expired, voting by mail will probably be the best vehicle to do so. But these are...
But I see here that at the bottom it says, with exception of those documents that you mentioned, it says, with exception of the U.S. citizenship certificate, the identification must be current or have expired no more than 4 years. So they could actually have a license or a Texas ID or a handgun license that could be expired, but as long as it's not expired more than 4 years, they can use it?
They can still use that documentation. We get questions all the time, well, can I take my voter certificate card in? Well, if you happen to absolutely not have any one of those documents on this list that we spoke of the photo documents, then there's another list of documents that you can provide. Maybe you lost everything during the storm, and that includes your wallet and your personal items with photographs. So with that being said, this is a list of supporting forms of ID that can be presented if you don't have those photo IDs. It includes a valid voter registration certificate. Now, this means the actual voter registration certificate card that you received in the mail, not a printout from online, but the actual certificate that you received by mail. A certified birth certificate, and it must be the original birth certificate. A copy of a current utility bill, a bank statement, government check, or any other type of original paycheck that identifies by government, or a copy of an original government document with your name and address on there, required if it contains a photograph as well. So this is the next list, should you not have any of the first 7 items to present at the poll. And within reason, if it is that you have to use the second list, any of those items on the second list, you are asked, after presenting a supporting form of ID, the voter must execute what is called a reasonable impediment form. And this is basically like an affidavit that says, I absolutely don't have these forms, so I'm presenting this in good faith effort. This is the reason why I'm presenting either my voter certificate or current utility bill, that you're basically just certifying that this is the information that you have to vote.
So can they vote? Do they get to vote a regular ballot if they use the
second list? They can. When every voter walks into the poll, one of the very first things they should be aware of is, to have one of those items to qualify to vote, but also, to just maybe you have a sample ballot or something to make sure that you're prepared at the poll. And one of the first things the clerks will ask is, do you have, your photo ID, or do you have this? They will check your information in the poll. Once they find you and identify you on the poll list, whether you have the first list or the second list, you will be permitted to get your access code to proceed to the voting booth. But again, if you don't have any one of those documents, you are able to vote what is called a provisional ballot. And that provisional ballot is not necessarily counted at that very time, but it's held for you to either cure if you don't have ID, or to vote by provisionally for many different reasons, to be notified after Election Day whether your ballot counted or not.
Okay.
So it can be an extensive process, and it can be very overwhelming for the typical voter that may not even know about a provisional process.
Right.
But what we've seen in Harris County is that almost 99% of voters have the acceptable forms of identification, or the everyday identification people use at the grocery store, or when they go to cash their paycheck, or to identify themselves for jury duty. That most of these forms of identification they do have, with the exception of the storm and the recent disaster. We do know that some folks were affected, and so we want to make sure that we get them voting as well.
I know that, the reasonable impediment declaration, I heard in reviewing some data that during the November election, that basically reduced the number of provisional ballots to where it was almost negligible.
Sure.
And I also read, I'm not sure this is true, correct me if I'm wrong, that the folks that typically did vote a provisional ballot, it was because they were just not on the poll book.
Sure.
So once they vote a provisional ballot, what do they have to do for that ballot to be able to be counted?
To be counted. So there's many reasons why you can receive a provisional ballot, but if it is because you don't have any of the forms of identification that is on one of those lists that we just went over, they have 6 days following Election Day to what is called cure their ballot. That is to provide any one of those documents or identification to say, I am Tanisha Hudspeth, or I am Hector De Leon. I am who I say I am when I attended the poll. And they can go to any of the county offices,
The tax assessors.
tax assessors' offices, not the county clerk's offices, to cure that provisional ballot and ensure that their ballot is counted. And curing just basically means, I forgot my ID and I can't drive all the way across town. I want to go ahead and vote now. So you vote a provisional ballot, and then you have up until 6 days after to go to the tax offices to say, here's my ID, or here's whatever form of identification, and then your provisional ballot can be cured and will most certainly still be counted toward that particular election.
Okay,
That's just one reason you would receive a provisional. There are many reasons, but that's probably going to be one of the most common.
What I've seen in data is that the overwhelming majority of people who vote provisionally is because they're just not registered to vote.
Or they're at the wrong poll.
Or on Election Day in
Yeah.
Texas, you have to be at the poll you've been designated to vote to be able to cast.
Yeah, so that's a good one. It's either they're not registered in Harris County, or maybe they registered, but they registered after the deadline. So for instance, for this election, November 7th, the deadline to have registered to update your information was October 10th, which is always 30 days prior to Election Day. And in most cases, that's it. Maybe they registered or put in their information past that 30-day extension, and they just won't be able to vote in this election. But it will ensure that they'll be able to vote if there is a runoff for November 7th. So if there's a runoff for any reason and they're qualified to vote in that race, they can vote as early as December or March of next year, which will be the primary period.
So I'm registered, I'm ready. What can I expect to see on the ballot this election?
You can expect to see quite a bit. We talked about one. There'll be 7 state constitutional amendments that voters should really pay attention to. The whole state of Texas will see that. So it doesn't matter if you're in Harris County or if you're in Fort Bend County, any of the counties in Texas, I believe it's 254 counties, will vote on those state constitutional amendments. We do have a chart here, so it also shows you there are other municipalities and jurisdictions that might be hosting their school district elections or bond elections. You'll also see the city of Houston. If you're in the city of Houston, there are propositions and bond elections under the city of Houston, as well as the Houston Community College. Houston Independent School District has candidates for trustee school board, but there are a large list of measures that you could possibly see on your ballot. Now, again, for the school districts and small municipalities that surround the city of Houston, you have to reside in those areas to see that on the ballot. So in order to vote for Bel Air, which is going to be the city of Bel Air or city of Baytown, you have to be in that city in order to see that on the ballot. But nevertheless, November 7th, everyone will see bonds, propositions. Some of those elections will call for candidates and contests. And with that comes bonds and propositions, comes a lot of reading and detailed information to pay attention to and understanding what for or against might mean on a proposition or on a ballot.
Right. So at minimum, all registered voters should see seven items on their ballot. I was noticing here on the totals when it comes to what's on the ballot. There's 89 candidates in total of I think it's 30 municipalities that are having elections on the ballot.
So 37 contests, 89 candidates.
And I'm thinking that City of Houston has 16 council districts plus 5 at large, plus mayor, plus controller. That would give you 21, 22, 23 contests. And typically if you have 2 or 3 candidates per contest, minimum if you had 2, that would be 46 candidates.
Just for the city of Houston.
For the city of Houston. And I guess where I'm getting to is that this is the first major odd number year election or November election.
That you won't see the mayor on the ballot.
You won't see any contest in the city of Houston. Do you think that will have an impact on turnout?
I do believe it will. I believe we have a chart or graph here that we'll talk about a little bit later here tonight that just kind of shows the impact of odd number year elections. And
we can go to it now.
Okay, great.
Page 13.
So typically, when you see an odd year election, much different than maybe a even year where you don't have a presidential election. And on this chart you can see here, it's actually broken down by age group and by election type. So if we look at 2015 and the demographics of each election, overall the percentage, I believe for the 2015 November election, which is typically an odd year, was a little bit about maybe 20% total. But one big question that we do get is, I don't see the mayor on my ballot, or I don't see the city council members. So for the first time, when voters go, it will be another 4 years before, or less than, before they'll see the mayor or vote on council members, which is in the past has been every 2 years.
Right.
So
I'm looking at this participation table, and I see the interesting parts are, for example, it shows that of the voters who cast ballots in 2016, they were 18 to 24 years old. There was 97,000, over 98,000 during the presidential election. But then when you see the midterm election in 2014, it was 23,000, or I think rounded off 24,000. So you went from 98,000 18-year-olds, 18 to 24-year-olds. People always ask, how did the young people vote? And it's showing you right there.
It's showing you right there.
That in 2016, you had 98,000 18 to 24-year-olds vote. And then in the 2014 election, you only had 23. And then in the last odd number year election, you had 11,000.
Sure.
So you see, I think the numbers on the side, it basically tells you the difference percentage. And it shows, for example, like 18 to 24-year-olds constituted 7.3% of the vote in 2016. And then in the last odd number year
Probably
election, it went down to
3.5.
2.6. It's 2.6.
Okay.
So
2.6 for 2015.
the
So we can assume with 2016 that 2016 was a presidential year, and typically turnout for presidential years are always much higher than another even year that maybe the president is not on the ballot. So 2014 we had the governor on the ballot for Texas, and a lot of local representatives that voters vote on, commissioners, precinct chairs. 2014 was more of a local year, so we'll assume because of the presidential is why the numbers between the 18 and 24 years and synonymously across the board as we go
yeah,
down, look through the ages, that the turnout is just much higher. But if you're
yeah.
comparing it to 2015, it will be, 2015, 2013, those odd years are just going to be a little bit lower than a typical even year election.
It's showing that between 18 to 49-year-olds in a midterm election and an odd number year election, the voters go down. And then in the age groups of 50 and over, the voters go up.
The voters go up.
So there's more consistency in voting patterns for older voters and younger voters. Everybody knows that, but I guess these numbers are actually showing you how it works out. And I see that 14 and 15 actually provides graphs, page 14 and 15, or charts that give you the numbers. And you can see how what we were talking about is displayed on page 15. And so it's interesting.
It's interesting.
So the bottom line is that this is an odd number year election, so we can expect the vote for 18 to 49-year-olds to be down.
To decrease quite a bit, but we can always get surprised about something when it comes to the elections process. But we can definitely look that age group to go down. They just tend to participate and become more aware in a presidential year. But with that being said, for that age group, a lot of the high schools around the area, many parts of Harris County, it's another way that our office gets involved with educating students on the elections process, and other ways that they can participate besides just becoming a registered voter.
Tell me about what the office does as far as outreach. I know you mentioned that you were on, I don't know if we can mention stations, but Radio 1 station. What do you do when you go on Radio 1?
So every election cycle, we're very fortunate to go on radio shows, talk about elections, talk about what's important, and to even answer live calls from callers about what their concern is or their questions about that election. So just this past Sunday, I was able to go on Radio 1 on their broadcast called Sunday Morning Live. And Sunday Morning Live, every Sunday is a different topic, but prior to elections, they always want to come on and talk about, early voting. And especially this topic post-Harvey, for those that's been displaced, how will they vote? What's most important for those voters to know if they're out of the county? We get to talk about legislation, what's changed since the last legislation process. How does it affect the elections process? What did our legislators vote on, or what did they, what happened in the process to increase voters or to help in the process going further?
I think that was here. Maybe you want to mention, as far as the voters are concerned, what legislation is occurred that actually
would be important
impact them. Yeah,
for voters
I think it's on page 12.
So one of those is HB House Bill 929, and this is all about military and overseas ballots and those who are serving our country. So their ballots must be received by our office no later than the 6th day after Election Day. So they're a little bit different from the normal voter that's within the county. We have to have received their ballots by mail 6 days after, which is the same time frame to cure your vote. Also, House Bill 1151, which a voter ballot postmarked by Election Day must be received by our office by 5 p.m. the next business day. And as we all know, the U.S. Postal Service, it's really important to know when you're putting it in the mail and how soon you can expect for it to be here. So if a voter is voting by mail and they applied for their application October 27th, and you want to make sure that once you get the ballot that you get it into our office by November 7th, or as long as it's postmarked by November 7th, that we receive it by 5 p.m. the following election day. Hopefully that doesn't sound too confusing, because those are a lot of times and dates thrown there. Also, if there are no postmark, then our office will receive your mail ballot up until 7 p.m. that day. So, for instance, a voter received their mail ballot, and let's give Hurricane Harvey as an example. I requested my mail ballot 30 days prior to Election Day, but I was able to come back home and move into my house. And I have this mail ballot, it's Election Day, and I'm not sure if it's going to be there in time in the mail. So at that time, this piece of legislation will allow the voter to come to our downtown office only, to provide that actual ballot by mail, and their ballot will be included. Moving forward, we have SB 957, which talks about political subdivisions and propositions. So on this ballot, they will see that the state propositions are by number, and any county or local propositions and amendments will be by letter. So City of Houston propositions will be by letter A, B, C, and state constitutional amendments will be by number. And last but not least, House Bill 658, which allows those with disabilities or mobile disability to go ahead in line at a polling location on Election Day. So they show up, it's 10 people in line. The election judge then has the authority to bring that individual, the disabled individual, to the front of the line to cast their ballot. And this covers the most effective. Of course, there are a lot of pieces of legislation that affected this 2017 year, but most important to this year's election.
So when it comes to actually voting by mail, unless you're in the military, you should do the best you can to make sure you have your ballot in by 7 o'clock on Election Day.
Sure, by 7 o'clock on Election Day is very important. And if you have applied that last day, October 27th, it's especially important because you still have to wait. Applying is just one step. You still have to wait for your ballot to come to you by mail and to vote it and actually send it back. So these are all really important parts of legislation, and especially with the military and overseas ballots, knowing that they have that grace period to vote. It's really interesting because a lot of people say, well, if they have up until 6 days, I thought once Election Day, no ballots can be cast. So election night, the votes are not official until the election has been canvassed. And a lot of people don't know that. They want to know, well, why were we still counting? Why are there a certain amount of ballots still added toward the end? Well, those provisional ballots, overseas ballots, all of those ballots are included and counted. And there's a myth out there that they're not, but they truly are counted, and the election is official once it's canvassed.
Which takes place, 8 to 11 days after election.
8 to 11 days after Election Day. So the results are still unofficial election night, and we've seen in past elections where some of the races were very close, and one provisional ballot or a couple of mail ballots can really change the course depending on how close that election is.
But more often than not, because those votes are widespread throughout the county.
They're widespread throughout the county, so.
I was gonna mention, so it's election night, the votes are in, and we're talking about when they're supposed to be there. People are always asking or talking about the posting the results.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that and how there's confusion about people thinking that 7 o'clock that the election results should be.
It should be up and done.
Yeah.
So as we all know, or may not know, Harris County is the third largest county in the United States. And we talked about polling locations on Election Day. This Election Day in particular, there'll be 735 polling locations. Each one of those locations have to report their mail ballots and I'm sorry, not their mail ballots, have to report their equipment shut down at 7 p.m. So at 7 p.m., the first results that voters can see on the ballot is, of course, the mail ballots. All the mail ballots that's come in early, all of the early voting in-person ballots. That's the first set of results. Well, if you still have voters voting at 7 p.m. or any time after that point because they were in line by 7, there's no way for our office to report how those precincts actually voted. And because we're such a large county, throughout the night, those precincts are reporting until the very last precinct. And throughout the night, you can go to harrisvotes.com under our election results tab and look at how those votes are turning out by precinct specifically. How many precincts are reporting at 7:15, 7:30, 8 o'clock? And so there are a lot of times that we get complaints that we want the results at 7, but it's not that simple. The only thing we can actually count at 7 is early votes, with the hopes that as the night proceeds, getting each poll reported. And so we can't be pretentious in certifying or just
So when
giving
you
information.
when you actually think about the process, there's if people are in line, the poll cannot close until every person that was in line by 7 o'clock is voted. It's processed.
If you're in line by
qualified and voted.
7 o'clock and it's a long enough line that people are still voting well into
So
8
it could
o'clock,
take people, yeah, and
it could take, we still have to allow those people to vote. So there's no way to provide results for a poll that hasn't even shut down yet.
so theoretically they have to shut down. They shut down at 8. They do their paperwork. It may take them 15, 20 minutes. So they could not be on the road until about 30, 40 minutes
Sure.
after
And it really
they
does
shut
depend
down.
on the size of the poll as well. If it's a large voting precinct, or depending on the amount of paperwork you had at that location, those judges or those clerks that's working that location are taking their time to make sure that the paperwork is efficient and it's filled out properly before they're going to a drop-off location.
So in a major election, theoretically, you could have people barely arriving at a drop-off location by 8:45 and 9 o'clock. And then,
That's correct.
And I know your office has people calling you. How come there's no results? The people haven't dropped off.
We hadn't received reported exactly.
Yeah.
People hadn't dropped off their actual. So this is just a conversation that voters should know, that voters should be aware of, that we can't give you a total number of
There's
count.
really no law that says that
That the election results have to be presented election night.
and well, it says it should be presented as they come in, as fast as you can provide
They're coming in
it.
as
They're
fast as
available.
the office can provide it. Sure.
And I think I also read that it says that if the election officials inside the central count decided that the results should not be released until they know that every person who's in line at a poll has voted. Mm-hmm. That means theoretically you could hold the results until you know that everybody who has been in line throughout Harris
Sure.
County
Our office is just really trying to do a courtesy to make sure that, we're sharing with voters what's coming in, at what time it's coming in, and that they're getting the most accurate information at that time. But truly, we could wait until every last poll is reported and then share the results.
Right. This reminds me of when I was younger and I would watch the election results, national election results for a presidential election, that at a certain point, the media, major media on the major networks started deciding not to report any results until poll was closed. And in fact, they wouldn't report results on the West Coast until they knew that all the polls had shut down, the election was over, if they closed at 8 o'clock, because they didn't want to influence the people wanting to go out and vote or not.
Sure. So. Well, let's talk about other ways that voters can get involved in the process. We talked about voting. Let's talk about
voting. One of the most important things of the elections process is the folks who actually conduct the election. Those are what the office does in relation to that.
Sure. Our office works very hard to make sure that every single last one of those early voting locations and 735 polling locations are staffed with competent election workers, are trained and staffed with competent election workers to make sure that voters are able to cast their ballot. And part of what our office does is help to recruit those individuals in the county that are willing to give their time and talent and to actually vote and make sure that they're placed at polling locations. So if I'm not mistaken, your wife has served as a clerk.
Yeah, my wife's the presiding chair and presiding judge of a polling location. one of the things that tell us about the languages. I know you have to recruit language folks, and I know that you guys been going to high schools to do this.
Sure. So one piece we talked about is the language provisions. So in Harris County, the ballot is not only in English, but it's in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese. And with that being said, we hire those individuals for certain precincts that require those languages, individuals who can translate and provide assistance in any one of those locations. And in Harris County, those include the Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese communities. And we have coordinators that work in our office, very efficient people that not only make sure that they're staffed and at the polling locations, but that the parts of Harris County have the information they need. And just honestly, another part of the process of getting involved beside voting is working the poll. And if you're 18 years of age, at least 18 years of age, you're a registered voter, you can serve as a clerk on election day.
So we've gone through from beginning what to be able to register to vote till the end what it takes to actually conduct an election. And I know that in high school, 16-year-olds can actually apply to work at the polls, and all they have to do is be U.S. citizens and get the approval of their principal and their guardian. So that's all the information that we have. And where do they go if they want information?
More information? All things relating to what we talked about tonight in elections is 713-755-6965. That's 713-755-6965 or harrisvotes.com. Applications to work the polls, to find out where to go vote, early voting, anything elections related is at harrisvotes.com. Part of that is if you choose to be an election clerk and you're 16 years of age, that's part of being the process. And you're paid for it as well. It's not just a volunteer opportunity.
That's the most important part.
So
we have covered everything that people need to know. Sure. As far as elections are concerned. I appreciate you being here. It was great information. And we appreciate the folks that have joined us for joining us, and get engaged, be civic-minded. Vote if you're registered, and if you want to work the polls, give us a call, and or give Tanisha a call, and she will make sure that you get incorporated into the voting process. Again, thank you. That's it for tonight.